Hello, welcome to this Literacy Trust conversation. I'm Andy Robertson. I'm a journalist specialising in the intersection between families and video games. Did you know that video games can help support young people's reading, writing, speaking and listening? According to new research from the National Literacy Trust, many young people say that playing games motivates them to read and to write. Video games also help those who don't enjoy reading as much to feel more immersed in a story than they do when they read a book. And video games help young people connect with their friends through play. A new campaign from the National Literacy Trust, Yuki and Penguin Random House, wants to raise awareness about how video game playing can be harnessed to support young people's literacy, creativity and well-being. Earlier this week, as part of this, I put together a list of games on the family video game database that I run that are really good to help get children reading. And today I'm here with scriptwriter, story designer and author Rhianna Pratchett to talk about all things video games and literacy and to explore her stellar career in the industry. So Rhianna, perhaps a good place to start would just be your journey into working with story and video games, which I guess for some people don't necessarily come together.
I'm going to take you way back, Andy, to when I was 6 years old and my dad got Mazogs on the Sinclair ZX81, which was a very chunky black and white machine. And he says I was a bit frightened of Mazogs when I first saw it because I'd never seen anything like it. And it was a little pixelated man running around a pixelated maze like this, being pursued by little pixelated crabby creatures. And it seemed kind of very scary and new. And then I realized a little pixelated man could pick up a little pixelated sword and actually fight back against little pixelated crabby creatures. And that seemed to sort of strike a chord in me, some kind of righteousness. And I started sort of falling in love with games then. And my father would give me his hand-me-down machines, and I'd play my own games in my room, or we get together and we play games. So we made them quite a social experience even before games become social in the way we think of them now. So I would sit next to him and I would get out the graph paper and I would draw the maps for him, because this is a long time before maps came into games or even into the boxes. But yeah, it was back then you had to draw your own maps. And Dad would kind of drive the game and I would draw the maps and navigate, or I would just tuck myself behind him in his big chair and kind of look out and hide for the scary bits if there was any scary bits. So it was very sociable. And after I stopped playing them so much with Dad, I played them with a little girl that lived next door because we lived in a tiny village and we had to make our own entertainment. So we used to play adventure games together and sort of trying to solve puzzles, King's Quest, Police Quest, and the Monkey Island games, things like that. And so yeah, it was always kind of very social, and it had been a long-term love affair really. And I studied journalism at university in London, and I ended up in my last year of university writing for a women's magazine called Minx. And then as part of the writing I did for them, they started covering video games, which is really unprecedented for a women's magazine back then, and still is unprecedented for a women's magazine. And it was aimed at 18 to 24-year-old girls, and it was a little bit more rock and roll, so I could see why it might cover something a little unusual. And from that moment, I actually started writing professionally about video games. I started getting on press lists, getting code sent to me, and I just slowly built up my career from there. So I started in games journalism and then kind of slowly moved out from there.
And so obviously, was that quite an exciting time to sort of get into, so you were playing it as a kind of a consumer, those lovely childhood memories, but then you kind of got into the industry and you were suddenly there getting games for free. What was it like, as that was happening?
It's not as getting games for free is not, as you all know, it's not quite as exciting as you think it's going to be, because you get sort of alpha and beta code. So you're sort of dealing with games that they'll be unfinished, they'll be buggy, they won't be complete. You may have to do elaborate things to get them to work. So it's not, quite as exciting as someone just giving you a fully formed game and you're ready to go. but when I started out, I was just doing freelance stuff. So it was just a little bit here and there. And after about a year or so of doing that, I started on PC Zone magazine, which was at the time the UK's oldest PC games magazine. And that's when I was doing it really full time. So I was working in an office, I was going out and about all around the world, talking to developers about putting games together and seeing how the sausage was made, really, and doing reviews and previews and little news stories, and really getting very, very immersed in the world of game development.
And so you're sort of edging there into territory of kind of this transition, I guess, from writing about games to thinking, oh, this is how they're made. And maybe, I guess, stories play a part of that. So how, in what you're seeing of this sausage factory, where do stories fit in what you were seeing there? Were they there predominantly at that time?
They were there, but no one was really talking about them that much. So no one ever, when I was a journalist, no one ever sat me down in front of a game writer. There was no me to talk to back then. Like the words were being written, stories were being created, but it was very much like in the back room, like not something that was pushed forward as part of game development, not something that was usually done by a professional writer. It was done by whoever had the time to do it, whoever was like to write stories in their spare time, or literally had the time and inclination to do it. It was one area of games development that wasn't done by a professional specialized in that field. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen the course of games narrative increase a huge amount, with games being recognized for their stories in awards, in conferences. The GDC in San Francisco has its own narrative track. You've got so many writers out there like me talking about the craft of writing for games and how we do it, and all the differences in writing for games as opposed to writing for other mediums. There's much more dialogue about it, and I think players are becoming more invested in our stories. I think publishers, developers are building relationships with writers, with narrative designers, with all sorts of different storytellers, storyboard artists, dramatic directors. And so I've really been lucky that I've seen this part of the industry change so much whilst I've been a part of it.
And I'd love to hear about maybe some of the specific games that you've worked on, and what it's been like to be there in sort of the guts of that game making, being the story person in those teams. How did that come together?
So I had gone freelance from PC Zone, and I don't think I ever really wanted an office-based job. I really wanted to kind of control my own career and choose the projects that I worked on. So I went freelance, and I got a phone call from Sven Vinke from Larian Studios, and Larian still very much alive and kicking and doing great stuff with Divinity Original Sin games. And back then they had released a game called Divine Divinity, which I'd really liked as a journalist, and they kind of remembered that, and they were looking for a native English speaker to help them localize and polish up the script, which had been written by a German speaker. And they thought of me because I'd really liked their previous game. This was a sort of kind of a standalone sequel to Divine Divinity. And I thought it seemed like an interesting way of, paying the bills and a new kind of opportunity. And, at that point I was doing the endless round of pitching that you do as a journalist. And I thought, this is something new. This is something I can kind of be creative with. And working on an RPG is very kind of hardcore work. There's so many different stories and plot lines and things to keep hold of. And I did some original content work, and I wrote a little novella to go with the game. And it was good fun. It put me off working on role-playing games for a long time. But I started to try and find out if I could get other work in the field. And it was so kind of Wild West back then that I could kind of like go up to people and say, hey, I'm doing this now. Do you need any help? And because there were so few game writers about, and even fewer game specific writers, that people were often quite desperate for help, because it, as I say, games narrative have been usually done by people that didn't necessarily know that much about storytelling and writing, and it was done kind of off to the side. It wasn't considered particularly important back then, and obviously that's changed a lot since.
And in terms of your education background, your kind of love of reading and gaming and books, how important was that so that you could then get into that industry?
Vitally important, I think, because it's all part and parcel of who I am. So I've always read. I mean, these days I probably listen to Audible books more than I read them, and I always read a lot as a kid. So my mum would give me a comic to read or a book to read instead of sweets or crisps, and that would kind of keep me occupied. And I was always in the library. And actually, that was where I got my first fighting fantasy book, which I think we're going to talk about later. And I just loved, I love reading. I love books. My parents used to read to me a bit, but I learned to read very fast and blew through all kinds of books. I had a real appetite for it. And I think reading, it broadens your understanding of the world, and it's so important for writers to read, and especially for them to read around the genre that they're writing for. So if they're writing fantasy books, then read history, read politics, read philosophy, pay attention to the world, be interested in people, be a sponge for information, and that's what I think reading at an early age, it helped create that sponge-like mind that a writer needs to kind of just pick up all stories and bits and pieces of information and color and characters. The kind of more you read, the more you broaden your mind. The more you broaden your mind, the better a writer you become.
And one of the things we're sort of talking about today is how video games themselves can play this role in helping, inspiring, improving literacy, particularly in young people who are playing them, who maybe find books a bit harder, or just they're more naturally drawn to games. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do games function in that kind of way, in instilling that kind of love of reading and language. Because I know that some people listening may think, well, games are just about pictures and sound, and they like movies, aren't they? Is they really reading?
Obviously it depends on the kind of game you're playing, and often even the biggest AAA titles have some element of reading in them, where you can pick up journals or letters, voice memos or things like that as you're going around the world. So even the most kind of high octane first person shooter type games will often have some element of actual reading in the world, but you're also getting story in a kind of a stealth way in games, which is interesting, because you're not just getting it through words and through text. You're getting it through the environment itself. Environmental storytelling is big in games, and obviously every medium uses environmental storytelling to a degree, but the real estate for it in games is huge. So players can poke around every corner of your world, and they can keep going back, and they can keep reading stuff, and they can keep trying to discover more and more. And so you need to populate that world with narrative. You need to use the level design, the art, the animation, the music to kind of help support the story. And so you often get kind of story in a stealth way because you're saturated by it. So you might get it in traditional forms, but you're getting it throughout the game, through every aspect of the game. You're absorbing the story, and I can see why that makes young people gravitate towards games as opposed to books, for example, because you're taking a big part in the story. The story is happening around you. You're not passively absorbing the story in the way you might be in a film or a TV or books. You are the story. You're interacting with the story. The story is being shaped often by your own actions. And that's a very powerful feeling.
It's like what a lot of things you're saying, I'm realizing and remembering, that video games really are media. It's easy for us to think they're just entertainment and separate them from sort of books. But there's kind of a pause back and forth, isn't there? And something you alluded to earlier was that some of the writing that you've done is of novels that support games, or that are kind of, there are books around games. How does that kind of writing differ to the sort of central stuff in a game? And I just love to hear more about that kind of world, really.
Well, I alongside the Tomb Raider games I worked on, so I worked on the reboot of Tomb Raider in 2013 and the sequel in 2015, Rise of the Tomb Raider. And in between that, I wrote a lot of comics with Dark Horse, and they sort of took Lara on various adventures in between the first and second game. So if you read the comics, they would actually fold into the second game. So there are little hints about the second game in the third arc of the comics. And that was a really fun thing to do, because you, as a writer, you come up with so much content for the games, and what players actually see in the games is probably only a small percentage of that. But you kind of have to build out the body of the iceberg that's underneath the water, and what the players experience in the game might just be the tip, but you've built out everything else below it, so that tip of narrative is very kind of truthful and well thought out, because you've built everything out below it. But that usually means that you have a lot of content that won't necessarily fit in the game. So having an outlet like comics can be a great way of expanding the world and keeping people interested in it, even when there isn't necessarily a game out. So that was really great to be able to explore the characters that were in the first game, and let players and readers into their lives more, and give them kind of more emphasis, and just kind of have fun with Lara, and explore some of the things that I particularly wanted to.
I think that's helpful for a parent and carer in particular, because being aware that a game can kind of lead children into reading books. We were talking earlier about the Knights and Bikes game, and I've just been looking at the books here, which are a complete kind of spin-off. But something which we talked about before we started recording were the fighting fantasy books that I remember playing. But I hear you've got your own one coming, and there's that kind of blurring again of between interactive fiction and just normal fiction. So
yeah, it's really exciting. As part of the PR for Tomb Raider, Ian Livingstone, who was part of Core, who created Tomb Raider originally, Ian and I were doing PR, kind of like Lara's old dad and Lara's new mum kind of thing. So we did a few PR things together, and I've known Ian for a long time. He does wonderful work in the games industry and beyond. And he approached me asking if I wanted to write a fighting fantasy book. And I'd read them as a kid, of course. I talked about getting them from the local library, but I hadn't read them for years. And I didn't realize that Ian and Steve Jackson were sort of slowly bringing them back, and they were asking guest authors to come in and write in fighting fantasy books in that world. And yeah, it just seemed like I wasn't sure I could do it, so it was sort of like, okay, I'm going to do it, because it's something I don't know about, and I'd like to learn how to do this, and I'd like to use what I've learned about game design and narrative and put that all together, and try and kind of interest and excite young people in the same way that fighting fantasy books did when I was a kid. So Crystal of Storms, it's called, and it's out on October 1st, and takes place on a floating archipelago of islands that are in the middle of a giant tempest, and you play as a member of the Skywatch, which are kind of like an aerial police force that police the islands of Pangaria, which is what the archipelago is called. And suddenly all your police force friends in the Skywatch are well, I won't give it away too much. They vanish basically, and you're the only one left, and you've got to kind of solve the crimes and find out what's happened, and and explore the islands and fly on wings and float around in the water on a bathysphere. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun to do, and I'm the first woman to write a fighting fantasy book. which is a little bit kind of overwhelming. And so I'm hoping, fingers crossed. We've also got a wonderful Eva, a wonderful illustrator, is the first woman to illustrate a fighting fantasy book as well. And it's a real, it's a little bit of a new departure, I think, and the cover is quite a new departure as well for the series, and we're trying to bring in a wider audience, because I think the way you market books to kids these days is not necessarily the same way as we marketed to the kids in the 80s. It's a little bit different. So, but it was really good to be able to use the intersection of what I'd learned about game design and what I learned about narrative to kind of put it all together. It was much more challenging, even though Ian warned me. And I thought, if the creator of Fighting Fantasy is going, it's really hard, like you should probably listen. And I did listen, and it was very hard, but it was sort of, is actually keeping all the bits together that's hard, because the player is choosing where they want to go next. So you've got to keep hold of the strands. You've got to make sure that the fights are interesting, what they can pick up and what they may have picked up, what they haven't picked up, how they might use it, and make sure that the structure of the book and where you put all the little chunks is like much more time consuming than you ever think it will be. And I think Ian still does it by hand, writing things out, and I tried various methods, and I sort of had I think I just used Excel spreadsheets and colored boxes and stuff like that, and gradually that kind of worked. And I had a great editor in John Green who sort of guided me through it, but it was really interesting and fun thing to be able to do, and so I'm quite excited about what readers are going to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds great. I can't wait to read it myself. And my kids are getting a bit older, but that's the sort of book that I would have maybe have shared with them. And again, I love the idea that it can almost work the opposite direction, that the book can actually introduce parents to what it's like to be in an interactive story, and as they go from reading the book together, then they can go to playing games together.
Yeah, I mean, nice. Absolutely. I do think parents playing games with children is really, really important. And I always remember a time where I was in San Francisco, and I was with a load of game developers in a bar, and the bouncer, who was a big brusque guy, came up to me and he said, I'm a bit worried about my daughter. She keeps playing a lot of like zombie games, and I'm kind of a bit, what, should I be worried about this? And I was like, well, we had a talk about it, and I was like, well, why don't you try playing them with her and seeing what she's getting out of them? And I think he'd sort of been watching his daughter playing what he considered to be sort of violent-ish games, and he'd sort of been worried, but he hadn't sort of educated himself about the content of the games. And I talked to him about playing games with my dad and that kind of social experience, and just to find out what his daughter's getting out of it, and to share something with her.
Obviously at the moment, we're kind of in the up and down of lockdown, or whatever stage we're at, kids and families are doing more sort of media stuff together, and I think there's been a realization from parents in general that actually there's quite a bit of good that kids are getting from games, and we talk about connection and well-being, but I'd love to get your insight on how, I guess, narrative and story in games, and just your perspective on how that can be helpful at this time for people of any age really, but I guess children who are playing games, and what they might be getting from them that it maybe isn't obvious to someone who's not kind of on the inside of the industry.
Well, I mean, games take you to different worlds, different experiences. They put you in the shoes of different characters, but there's also sort of different types of storytelling in there. So there is more traditional storytelling, where you might kind of get something that's a little bit more like a movie, or there are more things to read, or there's a very structured story to the game. But there's also the emergent story that happens as you are playing it, that comes out of the level design and mechanics for the game. But it's the sharing of those experiences. And often when I play games with my partner, we'll remember not necessarily what we would traditionally see as story, but also the things that happen or have a narrative around them, but happen to both of us because of how the gameplay is structured, how the levels are structured, that time you did that, and everything went to hell and got on fire and things like that, and all that time you managed to escape, and then you were wounded and I had to drag you out of battle, and that sort of kind of fun narrative that you bring up together. So there's lots of different ways you kind of absorb narrative in games. And when I was playing the adventure games with the little girl that lived next door, we used to play a lot of as I say, like King's Quest and Police Quest. We used to play Camelot, which was sort of set in kind of Arthurian times, and I learnt the word falafel from Conquest of Camelot was the full name of the game, and I didn't know what a falafel was because I lived in a tiny village in Somerset, a long way away from even a bad falafel, let alone a good falafel. And so I think I loved the sound of the word falafel, and I think the word falafel is greater and more interesting, and the texture when you say the word falafel is nicer than falafels themselves. So I remember distinctly like thinking the falafels were the most exotic thing because they'd kind of happened in that when the game went to the Far East, and there were falafels there and I'd never heard of them before. And then it probably took about 15 or 20 years before I actually had a falafel myself, and it was a bit of an underwhelming experience until I went to the Middle East myself and had a proper falafel. It's like, aha, now what I found in the game suddenly, like 30 years later, it's the narrative has merged with the reality.
If you have a child in that setting who really is getting into these games and thinks, well, maybe I actually want to take that journey of, well, how to become someone who does play a role in the narrative or in the game development, what would your advice be to a parent with a young person who has that passion but doesn't know, what are the steps, what courses should they take, how to do it?
I mean, it's a little difficult for me because I came in via journalism, and the opportunities in journalism are different. I don't know whether necessarily fewer, but they're different from what they used to be. So I worked in magazines, I worked in traditional print media, and there are much fewer magazines around these days. But there are many more websites, there are many more blogs and things like that. So if you were interested in being a game journalist, like as I was back then, you could start your own blog. You could start a blog with friends. You could just sort of practice writing reviews of games yourself, and read websites that do that every day and look at how games reviews are put together, and be able to look at games with a critical eye. So not just their story and narrative, but their gameplay, their level design, their art. So that's kind of one way of doing it. And for me, that allowed me to build up the contacts that I needed. So when I went into narrative, I had studios that I could approach that knew me. But I always say that I think at its heart, it's sort of threefold. It's play a lot of games, look at the different ways that narrative, assuming you want to go into the area I work in, assuming you want to go in kind of as a writer or a narrative designer, look at the way that narrative is used in games and all the different ways narrative is used in games. So not just in the ways that it's used like a movie or a TV series, so cutscenes or cinematics, which are very film-like. Look at the way that the level design contributes to the narrative. A game like Psychonauts, for example, that uses level design as character. So you play through the literal mindsets of some of the characters, so that what's going on inside their heads become the level themselves. And I always thought that was a kind of beautiful way of using what wouldn't necessarily be considered narrative in other mediums as narrative in games. And obviously you've got a lot of environmental storytelling, so the art, the structure of the levels, as well as things like documents and letters and memos and graffiti, your voices in your ear, your answer phone messages, all kinds of things. So yeah, look at the way that narrative comes to you as a player. So playing lots of games is the first thing, and honing yourself as a writer, like practicing your writing skills, maybe finding peer groups, peer writing groups that you can give writing samples to, you can get feedback. Just continue, writing creative essays. Usually I think English still has a kind of creative writing component to that. You have to keep honing yourself as a writer, and that never stops. So, all writers are continually growing themselves as writers. They're continually reading. So I've talked about the importance of reading when you're a writer, which I don't think gets emphasized enough. It's the things that broaden your mind. It's that writers still have to take themselves off to kind of new places and new experiences, whether that's through books or whether that's through video games. You always have to broaden your mind. You always have to kind of keep feeding the narrative sponge. It kind of, you've got to keep giving it more content and keep being interested about the world. So I think that's very important as well. And there's also free software. You can get the Ink engine by Inkle Studios, which they made 80 Days with. Is very good. You can get that for free. You can practice writing stories and branching narratives in that, and also Twine as well. You can do the same thing. So you can actually put a story together in Twine or Ink and actually see it kind of play out. It would just be text-based, but it would give you a kind of an idea of how to do branching narratives where you've got kind of different choices that lead to different things. And kind of, beyond that, you've got bigger and more expensive ways of creating games, like Game Maker or Unity, for example. We're into kind of more expensive areas then. So sort of trying out Twine and Ink, if you're interested in game writing. And a little bit further on, going to network really to talks and conferences about the games industry business, and that will usually, as part of it, have a games narrative track, games design tracks. There might be a show floor where you can look at games that are in development with various developers, and they're usually early stages, and you can kind of network and get to know developers and become friends. And you can find groups of peers that want to make games, and find like-minded people, and make your own games together. It's now easier than it's ever been to make your own games. And I think the indie scene has really flourished in the last 8 to 10 years, and we're seeing much more smaller games coming out that are, some of them, made by one person. For example, Lucas Pope, who did Papers, Please, and Return of the Obra Dinn, is a one-man band, or at least he was for Papers, Please. 80 Days, for example, only had a small team. You can do a lot yourself if you're kind of willing to kind of research and put in the hard work and learn how to put stories together in games. It comes down to playing lots of games and looking at the ways in which narrative is being created in those games, and all the different non-traditional ways that narrative is being created and conveyed to you as a player in these games. And play all kinds of different games, not just sort of AAA games, but smaller budget indie games as well. Just play as widely as possible. Hone your writing skills, keep writing creatively as much as possible, try and get feedback where you can, and read widely and deeply as much as you can. And then a bit further on, try and network, and that can be lightly with community forums, it could be with modding forums. You might put together a blog with friends, you might go to a game conference and listen to some talks and meet developers and things like that. So those are the kind of main ways of that I suggest. There are lots of game courses out there. I don't know too much about them. They're often very design focused, but they usually have some kind of narrative component in them. And so they're kind of definitely on the rise. But you can just go out there and start creating games and start writing stories in games with free software that you could do that this minute.
Yeah. And some of that, the free stuff, is kind of just on a console, isn't it? So while you're talking, I was reminded of Mario Maker
Hmm.
on the Switch, and then obviously there's Dreams on the PlayStation 4. But
Yeah.
also Roblox is a really big game for kids these days, and obviously that is already a game platform which you can make games yourself in. So, are those still sort of good things to do alongside Twine and
Yeah, definitely. I think anything that where you can kind of look at how games are put together and try stuff out, and use your imagination and your creativity to kind of build something can be very satisfying. And in doing that with your siblings, with your friends, with your parents, especially during kind of lockdown times, and creating things together, I think is wonderful.
That's great. It's been a really helpful conversation. I've learned loads talking. So
Good.
thank you for your time, Rhianna. It's been really good.
Thank
I know I want to thank the National Literacy Trust for putting this all together, and they've got some resources. So the things we've mentioned will be on that page, and there'll be links to them. And of course, we've got the list of games that are good to get kids reading as well. So thanks for watching, and do follow National Literacy Trust, and you can visit them at www.literacytrust.org.uk/video games to get all those resources. Thanks again.